Welcome back to lesson 2 in this series on sorrow over my sin from 2 Corinthians chapter 7. What we want to do this morning in our brief time together, first of all, let's get some historical context as we take the next several days to pull this passage apart. Did you realize that there were 4 letters written to the Corinthians? 2 of the letters were placed in the canon. The other 4 letters were not. Those men who examined the various epistles that were written by the men determined that 2 of the letters to the Corinthians were not meeting the standard of requisitions, if you please, for inclusion in the canon. So we only have 2 of the letters to the Corinthians. Now, 1 Corinthians is addressed to dealing with church issues. In fact, in chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, because 2 Corinthians follows up on this letter, Paul writes, "For I have been informed concerning you, my brethren, by Chloe's people." So these are people who attended the church at Corinth, "that there are quarrels among you." So Chloe's people went to visit with Paul, and they shared their burden of what was going on in the Corinthian church. Now, Paul was the founder of the church. He had spent a considerable time there evangelizing and discipling. And so these people were concerned about the erosion of Paul's work. And so they visit with Paul and they tell him, "We've got some concerns about what's going on in the church. And let me share with you what those concerns were from 1 Corinthians. In chapter 1, verse 12, there was division over church personalities. Paul says, some of you are of Peter, some of you are of Apostle, some of you are of me, some of you are even of Christ. And so he speaks to the division over church personalities. And then he addresses the immorality that was being condoned by the church of this son sleeping with his stepmother, and the church bragging about it. And Paul tries to shame them, saying to them that even the Roman and the Greek culture would not tolerate such a flagrant violation of sexual sin. Then he talks about lawsuits between believers. Believers can act ungodly, can't they? And so in Corinth, there were people who were pledging to do work, and they did a half-hearted job, and so there was no way to recoup the money because they're in a Roman society which was bent towards those who had it and against those who did not have it. And so Christian was taking Christian to court, and Paul says, look, if you're a believer, surely there is somebody spiritual enough in the church to weigh the matter and make a decision. Then in chapter 7, verse 1 and following, he deals with marriage and divorce, remarriage, and addresses the issues of singles. In chapter 8, verse 1, he talks about the use of our Christian freedoms, that we should not use it as a cloak to commit sin or to be a model or an example to lead others away. Then he talks about conduct in the church in chapter 11, verse 1 and following. And then chapter 11, verse 23, about abusing the Lord's table, coming in an unworthy manner. The rich people arrived first for the communion dinner, if you please, before the table, and they consumed all of the food. And when the blue-collar workers came in, there was friction between them. because the rich people were being selfish. And then he talks about abusing their spiritual gifts. In particular, he focuses in on the sign gifts back then, which were tongues, speaking in tongues, and interpretation. And he gives a straightforward discourse that back then, if these spiritual gifts were displayed, there was a biblical procedure on how to do that. So what we come to here in chapter 7 is this. The Apostle Paul is encouraging these saints for their genuine repentance over sin. Now, if you look at 2 Corinthians 7, permit me to read the first several verses. Paul says, "Therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all defilement of flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of the Lord." And so he's encouraging the church to continue the cleansing and the purification process of the membership. He goes on to say in verse 2, "Make room for us in your heart. We wronged no one. We corrupted no one. We took advantage of no one." They had accused Paul of these things, and they have questioned his appearance. They had questioned his speech. They had questioned his motivation. And he's reminded them, he's asking them, hey, remember our time together and reflect. I did not harm anybody when I was among you. I do not speak, verse 3, to condemn you, but I have said before that you are in our hearts to die together and to live together. So he is identifying with them. He is not above them. He is not beneath them. They are equals. He goes on in verse 4, "Great is my confidence in you. Great is my boasting on your behalf. I am filled with comfort. I am overflowing with joy in all of our affliction." So in the midst of what Paul is going through, he finds joy in the Corinthians who are dealing with spiritual matters in a biblical way. Verse 5 says, "But even when we came into Macedonia, our flesh had no rest, but we were afflicted on every side, conflicts without, fears within. But God, who comforts the depressed, comforted us by the coming of Titus, and not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted in you, as reported to us your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoice even more." And then Paul goes on and talks about the letter that contained the excommunication of the immoral man in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Then he encourages the church in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. The man has repented, and here are the next steps that you need to take to bring him back into the body. And in verses 9, 10, and 11 that we're going to look at, he simply explains once again the purpose for sorrow, the types of sorrow, that which is accepted by God and that which is rejected by God. So the next time we get together, we will remind ourselves of Paul's affirmation to this church, as I've just read to you. And then we're going to begin to talk about the two types of sorrow. If you want to read verses 9, 10, and 11, see if you can spot the two types of sorrow and list the characteristics of what those sorrows are as Paul describes them. Thanks for tuning in. This is Wednesday. Hopefully I'll see you. I won't see you. I'll speak with you tomorrow. God bless.